なたは私の導きであり、私の隠れ家におわします。私はもう悲しみもせず、憂いもいたしません。幸せで喜びに満ちたものになります。お神よ、私はもう不安に心を満たすこともなく、困難にも悩まされません。また人生の不快なことにも煩わされません。お神よ、あなたは私自身よりもっと私に親しいお方におわします。お主よ、私自身をあなたに捧げ祭ります。
Thank you very much for that prayer in Japanese, Jasmine. Just stay for a few seconds. I'm going to welcome everybody. Hopefully you can also help me to welcome the friends from Japan. Hopefully this is not just one-off. Hopefully this will be a sort of relationship from people to people, our friendship and our Baha'i friendship for this spiritual axis. Which is can be misunderstood, but then hopefully after grand presentation and Q&A, we have better understanding of this. So Jasmine, do you mind just welcome our friends from Japan in Japanese, please? Just say a few words.
Sure. 本日はお忙しいところ、この活動に参加くださり、誠にありがとうございます。短い間ですが、皆様楽しくお過ごしいただければ幸いです。
Oh, thank you very much. I will ask you to translate in English, but okay. Right, Graham is back to you now. So you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, and I want to thank you, Well and Leong, and your friends who I understand occasionally get together to discuss matters of importance to the Baha'i friends in the Asian region. And in this session today, we are going to discuss the spiritual axis. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll share with you. And there's a lot of text and there's a lot of information, but I want you to look beyond that and identify 2 or 3 points that are either new to you or you're happy to be reminded of. And in that way, the session will be beneficial. Let me just share my screen. And I'll try to get that into a PowerPoint presentation. The spiritual axis is a timely subject for us to discuss as the Baha'i community enters into the 6th epoch of the formative age. And I note that it's 65 years now since the term was used by Shoghi Effendi. It's 40 years since the Canberra Conference of 1982. And it's 25 years since the Spiritual Axis Conference was held in Sydney in 1997. I want to just cover 3 topics tonight. The first is where does the term originate? And secondly, what are some of the spiritual principles involved? And the third is what are the developments that can be discerned? Doing this presentation gave me cause to think back on some months that I spent in Japan in 1999, basically in Nagoya, but with the friends in Tokyo and Akita as well. And although I've traveled widely over the Asia Pacific, I have very fond memories of my time with the Japanese Baha'i friends. So thank you so much. And thank you for those who are able to come into the session tonight after so many years. I put this up to show some of my Japanese friends, some of whom are on this session tonight, but also to show that I haven't changed much in all those years. The jacket still fits. It doesn't actually, but you like to think it does. Let's look at this term spiritual axis. The term wasn't used by Abdu'l-Baha, but in Tablets of the Divine Plan revealed in 1916, Abdu'l-Baha specifically mentioned countries in Asia and the Pacific. He sought people who spoke those languages. Spiritually, they were severed, holy, sanctified, filled with the love of God, who turned their faces to and traveled through the great island groups of the Pacific, and also mentions in the same tablet, Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, also to Japan. Isn't that interesting? Asiatic Russia, Korea, French Indochina. Well, some of these countries have now come to independence under different names. You've got another interesting sentence that I hadn't really picked up before. He says, how good would it be if there were any possibility of a commission composed of men and women to travel together through China and Japan, so that this bond of love may become strengthened, and through this going and coming, they may establish the oneness of the world of humanity, summon the people to the kingdom of God, and spread the teachings. So these very early references that bring together countries of the Asia and Pacific. And so in these early years, in response to Abdu'l-Baha's call, Agnes Alexander, even before the tablets, arrived in Japan, 1914. Claren Hyde-Dunn arrived in Australia and also took the teachings to New Zealand. Agnes Alexander also traveled to Korea. And so these early years, in the final years of the Center of the Covenant, Abdu'l-Baha, and then in the early years, Shoghi Effendi's ministry, there's small inroads are made, small footsteps are taken in these countries of both Asia and the Pacific. Apart from the establishment of the Australian and New Zealand National Spiritual Assembly in 1934, there wasn't much reference to that link until 1957. And this is the well-known passage. I've broken into at least 4 slides so that we can understand the originating source of this concept. This letter written by Shoghi Effendi to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Australia in 1957. The emergence of a new regional spiritual assembly in the North Pacific area, with its seat fixed in the capital city of a country, so this is in Tokyo in Japan, which by reason of its innate capacity and the spiritual receptivity it has acquired, in consequence of the severe and prolonged ordeal its entire population has providentially experienced, is destined to have a preponderating share in awakening the peoples and races inhabiting the entire Pacific area to the message of Baha'u'llah, and to act as the vanguard of his hosts in their spiritual future spiritual conquest of the main body of the yellow race on the Chinese mainland. The emergence of such an assembly may be said to have at long last established a spiritual axis, extending from the Antipodes to the northern islands of the Pacific Ocean, an axis whose northern and southern poles will act as powerful magnets endowed with exceptional spiritual potency, and towards which other younger and less experienced communities will tend for some time to gravitate. This is just his opening paragraph in his footnote to this letter to the Australian National Assembly. But we see that he says with the formation of a regional Baha'i institution in the North Pacific, there is at long last this link that he can now pronounce between the North and the South, which was not possible before this time. It was not timely, it was not possible. And so he's speaking of this region, which we now call the Asia Pacific. It has Australasia, has Oceania, has Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia. The boundaries are not so clear, and to a certain extent, it doesn't matter. But what does matter is that there is this concept of a North Pole and a Southern Pole to this axis, and that the communities, the smaller communities that emerge will work with these more established communities and form a source of attraction to the Baha'i teachings. I may not read through all of these in detail because they are readily available on the internet. But he does talk about some of the challenges that we face in establishing this relationship, the distance that separates us, their differences in race and language and custom and religion, and political forces that tend to keep us apart, foster antagonisms. And despite these challenges and limitations, our task is to maintain close and continued association of these communities in our common, peculiar, and paramount task of raising up the world order of Baha'u'llah. Shoghi Effendi refers to this as a responsibility at once weighty and inescapable, and says that we in these communities are in a privileged position. And he calls this a vast and turbulent area of the globe. And then he talks about a twofold task. Now he's talking to the Australian National Assembly at this time. The first task is to consolidate the Australian Baha'i community through the length and breadth of the Australian Commonwealth and in the islands beyond its confines, because this is during the World Crusade years. But the second of the tasks is in anticipation of the mission which the newly fledged Baha'i communities, now rapidly multiplying throughout the length and breadth of that area, are destined and are collectively called upon to discharge. So you can see that Shoghi Effendi is looking to a future time when these communities constantly collaborate, collectively called upon to discharge our responsibilities. He refers to this wide awake, swiftly expanding, steadily consolidating, highly promising community must lend whatever assistance is possible to its newly emerged sister community in the South. He's talking about the Northeast Asian community in that case, and enable her as her institutions develop and become firmly grounded to share in a befitting manner in the collective enterprises that must sooner or later be launched and carried to a successful conclusion by the island communities situated in the northern and southern regions, as well as in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. This is a letter of 1957. And it's calling on the Baha'is of North Asia, the Baha'is of the South Pacific, to work together, including collaboration with those communities in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. So this is the area that we're speaking of. And it makes you wonder whether there are other special responsibilities given to other regions within the Baha'i world that we have not focused on in the past. But this is our responsibility in the Asia Pacific. Now, in current times, there's near 50 countries that have come out of different political status in Asia and the Pacific. And there are Baha'i communities throughout East Asia, North Asia, Southeast Asia, Australasia, Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. And these are the communities that are called on to collaborate and overcome our differences of language and culture and tradition and work together with our shared vision of the oneness of humanity. What an exciting prospect, what a daunting prospect for us to consider, let alone to conduct and to conduct successfully. But that is the challenge that we face when we talk about the spiritual axis. Now, I've picked out just 3 principles that are involved, and I rely heavily on the work of Dr. Peter Kahn in this because he wrote about these at length. And the first he talks about is magnetism, because the idea of magnetism, he points out, is in the Baha'i writings, in the writings of Abdul Baha, in all the letters of Shoghi Effendi, and indeed in the messages of the Universal House of Justice. Abdul Baha says the divine magnet, the power of the word of God, will attract the hearts. The greatest means for the union and harmony of all is spiritual meetings. This matter is very important and is a magnet to attract divine confirmation. Of course, Peter Kahn was an electronics engineer, and he was very excited about the correlation between the ideas of physical magnetism and spiritual magnetism. But the point is, he often said in his talks that if one aligns oneself with the spiritual principles of the faith, that that alignment, in a sense, setting our sights and our character and our actions in the right direction, will attract potency that would otherwise not be available to us, whether alone or as we work in collaboration with others. The second of those spiritual principles that Peter Kahn often emphasized was that of organic growth. And his point here is that the Baha'i epochs do not unfold in a linear, constant process. Organic growth contains periods of bursts of growth and change, and at other times slow and steady consolidation where that growth is not necessarily as evident. So we might say that period from the time of Abdul Baha's vision for Asia and the Pacific, calling on individuals to travel, and the time when Shoghi Effendi could announce that there was a spiritual axis, a period of some 50 years between the two, before it was timely to make that announcement, because the entities have not lined up and become magnetized in that way to make them an attractive force. So similarly with organic growth, that there's a timeliness to each phase of that growth. We know that it requires intensive effort, and we also know that it's destined to unfold over an extended period of time. And I think it's that appreciation of the unfoldment over a period of time that we need to be conscious of and to work with. So this is quoting from Peter Kahn. He wrote in the 1980s, "This kind of growth is mysterious in nature and contributes much to the beauty and wonder of the universe. Its mystery arises from the inability of a human being to grasp fully the divine principles that govern organic growth, or to comprehend the internal spirit that motivates this growth." And when I read this, I'm reminded, for example, of the early Christian missionaries who traveled through Europe, one country after the other, often to be persecuted and to lose their lives, but for the love of Christ. And yet, over a period of time, they conquered those European countries and converted them to the Christian faith. And then on the basis of that, the Christian nations emerged and built whole cultures of compassion and love, apart from all the other problems that came along with the intricacies of Western civilization. But the point is that there was this organic unfoldment of the teachings of Christ. And in the same way, there's this organic unfoldment of the Baha'i pioneers who go to lands that are not their own, a foreign culture, they adapt, they get a foothold, and over a period of time, communities emerge, and after that, institutions emerge, and the next step is finding how those institutions can collaborate in these international endeavors. So Peter Kahn points out that this organic growth of the worldwide Baha'i community defies comprehension. It's a consequence, its strength, its potential, its internal dynamism are gravely underestimated. If someone were to look at the strength of Baha'i communities across the Asia Pacific at the moment, they might wonder how these communities are going to have an impact on the large societies of mainland Asia, for example. But just imagine that last time we spoke at institutional meetings about the spiritual axis, we didn't have Baha'i houses of worship in Papua New Guinea, in Samoa, in Cambodia, and they are there now. These institutions are emerging before our eyes, maybe not as fast as we would like, but there's this unfoldment that takes its time. And the third strong principle is unity and diversity. It's the very fact of the differences in these societies that bring the power of attraction, in which differences of race, of culture, of history are complementary rather than divisive, and they yield mutual benefits. And Peter Kahn points out that the Australian continental region embraces the Pacific. When we say Australasia, we could say Oceania, but it's mostly ocean. It's not land. It's mostly islands, more than 10,000 over a vast area. And they're lightly populated. There's only about 12 million people across the Pacific Islands. And contrast that with the vast Asian continental landmass. More than half the entire population of the world is on that landmass, if you include South Asia in that, as well as North and East Asia. And the second point Peter Kahn makes about this diversity is that the Asian believers bring to the Baha'i community the richness of their cultural traditions, which are rooted in the wisdom of the great religions of the prophetic cycle. On the other hand, the Australasian Baha'is come from cultures that are free from the fetters of religious orthodoxy. In most parts of Australasia, the religious institutions are only 250 or 300 years old. They're not thousands of years old. And it means that individuals can relatively easily break free of tradition and ecclesiastical authority and make their own choice to be Baha'is. And there's another little nugget of diversity that Peter Kahn puts into this phrase. He says that the individualism, which is dominant in Australasia, is balanced by the emphasis on social cooperation and collective action in much of Asia. So there's these diverse attributes of the human family that we find when we bring these communities together, and they complement each other. They're not the same, they're different, but they're complementary, and our task is to learn how they weave together to form this new society that we're building. So I've introduced 3 principles there, and yet there are these barriers to overcome. Shoghi Effendi points out in that 1957 letter, maybe it's still the same conditions, maybe we've overcome a little, the great distance that separates them, that we differ in race, language, custom, and religion, that there are active political forces that keep us apart in many ways, and political antagonisms. To a certain extent, these are here, but to a certain extent, since he wrote in 1957, we can see that some of these elements are melting away. We don't feel the great distance. We communicate, such as even in this session. We are learning each other's languages. We're respecting each other's customs, and we're certainly trading with each other. We enjoy each other's products. So much Australian natural product and New Zealand natural product goes to Asia. So many Asian goods and manufacturers come to this part of the world. Everybody benefits from the industriousness of our region. So having looked at some of those principles of the gradual unfoldment, of this organic nature of change, of the unity in diversity that we have, and the principle of magnetism, I want to now change to looking at, well, what are the developments that I can see in this period? Well, we started with the formation of not only the New Zealand National Assembly in 1957, but at the same time, the regional spiritual assemblies in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, which triggered this. The following year, there were intercontinental conferences in Sydney and Singapore. And my understanding is that the first Japanese Baha'i to come to Australia came to that international conference in 1958. There are formation of other national assemblies at this time. There's the dedication of the Sydney Temple. And then we come to the 9-year plan. I won't go through these in detail, but you can see by looking, as you glance down this page, we see national assemblies being formed throughout Asia, throughout the Pacific. Oceanic conferences being held in which friends travel. Asian friends come to the Pacific and to Australasia, and Australian, New Zealand, Pacific friends travel to the Asian conferences. 1971, Oceanic conferences in Jakarta, we moved to Singapore, in Suva, and in Sapporo, Japan. These small experiences of engagement between individual Baha'is at these conferences are sort of a harbinger of more complex relations that are to come later. And we find throughout the 1970s still the formation of more spiritual assemblies in different parts of Asia Pacific. A very important conference held in Canberra in 1982. And interesting to read that it was to be held in Manila. It was moved to Canberra due to the political uncertainties in Philippines at the time. But the House of Justice, when they announced those conferences, said that it was being held at the midpoint of the spiritual axis. Their idea was to find a country halfway between, or in between Asia and Pacific. And unfortunately, it left the Philippines, but for Australia's good fortune, it came down to Canberra. And we find that at this time that a number of items appeared in the magazine called US Bahai News, which were specifically about the axis. There was a meeting held prior to the Canberra conference. We find that then auxiliary board member Kimiko Schwerin came to represent the NSA of Japan to meet with the Australian National Assembly in preparation of the Canberra conference. House of Justice saw this as a reminder of the spiritual axis. So I just highlighted here that writing to the National Spiritual Assembly of Northeast Asia, the Guardian referred to the spiritual equilibrium as a momentous development paving the way for the eventual introduction of the faith into the far-flung Chinese mainland and beyond it to the extensive territories of Soviet Russia. The Universal House of Justice sent a special message to the 1982 conference. And I picked out just one or two small sections of that. So in 1982, the Universal House of Justice takes the opportunity to remind the Friends of Shoghi Effendi's 1957 letter. And that's the letter that's in italics at the bottom of that page. We've read that letter tonight in this session. And they say these guidelines, penned a quarter of a century ago, are as valid today as when they were written and can be taken to heart by all Baha'i communities on either side of the axis. The House of Justice wanted the Baha'is at that time in the 1980s to know that Shoghi Effendi's advice from the 1950s was still valid, as valid today as when they were written. And we find that that Canberra conference, this is, I put the open evening to show how special that was for those friends who were there. We had greetings from Hand of the Cause Yogo Giocari, from Hand of the Cause Collis Featherston, and Councillor Annalise Bob. This is a historic time that the Friends no longer have the bounty of being welcomed to a conference by these dear hands of the cause. And one of the sessions was on the spiritual axis. And in this, members of the National Assembly spoke about this bond.
A little bit, please.
And, you know, I have to say, I don't have notes. I was there. Did we listen? Was it recorded? Do we know what was said? Have we been listening? Tonight's session is a reminder to me that when we do have these occasions to allow our institutions to speak about what they see as potential, we need to find ways to listen. And I see that there was a panel of speakers in that session, from not only from Australasia, Councillor Ben Ayala was from Hawaii, and others from Asia, Hong Kong, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Cook Islands. Having that dialogue between those communities that were part of the Asia-Pacific axis. And as a special meeting between the NSA of Australia and Japan that was held at the time of the conference. And subsequently, there were visits by Japanese friends to Australia. There were 45 Japanese friends came to the Canberra conference, 35 from Tonga, 20 from Hawaii, 120 from New Zealand. It really was a gathering from the Asia-Pacific spiritual axis. And the House of Justice sent in this message to this conference, they said, it is an ardent hope of the House of Justice, the friends from your communities, motivated by the high spirit generated at the conference and continually encouraged by your institutions, will provide a constant stream of traveling teachers to those islands in need of assistance throughout the Pacific. So again, it's bringing together the spiritual access countries and the Pacific Islands. And there were instances with Japanese friends welcomed Australian Baha'is as well. So this whole period through the 1980s, there is a small sharing of travel teachers. But there's more work to do to establish those communities in the North Pacific. You see the Knight of Bahala Sean Hinton for Mongolia. There's Knights of Bahala for Sakhalin Islands. And so this still unfolding of these communities throughout the region. And then there was another meeting in Sydney, specifically on the spiritual axis in February of 1997. I had the program there, which I didn't need to go into in detail. But Peter Khan spoke at this time and he referred to one small project. It was a joint teaching project between the North Pacific and the South Pacific to take travel teachers to the Caroline Islands. And he wrote, important as it is, this will prove to be no more than the beginning of a vast program of collaboration in projects in the Pacific Islands and Asia, stretching forth into the distant future of the formative age of the faith. And I think that's important to contemplate the time scale that is involved in this unfoldment of the spiritual axis. What can we expect in the short term? What can we expect in the medium term? And what is the long-term vision for this relationship? So I'm going to summarize now the developments that I've spoken of. I've suggested up to 1957, the whole of the Asia Pacific region experienced social turmoil. There was conflict, there was economic competition. And during this period, the small Baha'i communities were emerging, but they were in the process of establishing their national institutions, both in the North and the South. And since that time, those communities have multiplied, the Baha'i institutions have multiplied, the numbers of national assemblies and Baha'i houses of worship have multiplied. Outside of the Baha'i community, there's growing signs of cooperation and interdependence. When one thinks of the extensive economic engagement in the Asia Pacific, which you might call the Asia Pacific political economy, doesn't have the tensions that it had before 1957. And nonetheless, we still need to apply our awareness of the regional dynamics with a sense of wisdom, because there still are tensions in the region. And the last thing that the Baha'i community wants to do is to in any way be involved in that, because our mission is to bring humanity together and to unite the hearts. The other themes that we can see since 1957 is the growing links between these Asia Pacific Baha'i communities at the level of the individual, the pioneers that have gone and lived throughout the region, and the institutional engagement that we've seen in small scale. But we have the potential to take this collaboration forward and to find ways to build the synergistic actions envisaged by Abdul Baha, by Shoghi Effendi, and by the House of Justice. And so for that reason, I think it's splendid to have this opportunity to consult tonight, to listen to each other. We have members of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Japan in the session with us. We want to hear their thoughts. Please, let's share some thoughts with each other, and let's make this a momentous occasion tonight for discussing the future of the spiritual axis. Friends, thank you for listening to this brief presentation. I'm going to end my slideshow, and I'm going to invite maybe our friends from Japan to say something, and then we'll open to some questions.
Graham, can I just say a few words just quickly?
Yes, please, Brian.
Yes, friends, sorry I haven't introduced Graham to you. I think most of you already know who he is. He was very modest and said, I'm going to read out the whole list of things he achieved, what he is and what he has been doing. But needless to say, I think I should apologize to him. I should have done it at the beginning. This is a belated acknowledgement of him as not only as a Baha'i scholar, but also academics in his profession. And he's very interested in the three areas, as you know, on governments and policy and so on, special emphasis on Pacific islanders. And he also wrote a lot of articles in journals, as you know, being academics. And also he wrote a few books. And currently, I think he's working on the history of Baha'i faith of PNG. This is Papua New Guinea. He had taught many universities in New Zealand, in Australia, Switzerland, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, just name a few. Okay, now, as you can see, he's obviously done a lot of research. Some of the things I've never seen before. I'm not sure about you. I'm going to ask him some questions later on. But before we open for questions, can we just vote? Can we just give an applause of vote of thanks just for the presentation? Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you very much, Willen. I did put an invitation to Mr. Sonda-san. If you wanted to say something, we'd love to hear from you tonight.
Okay, thank you. Hello, APA friends. My name is Nozomu Sonda from Japan. Well, when I was invited to participate in this talk, to be very, very frank and honest, I was very taken by surprise because our work has been very much focused on the grassroots level. As you know, over the last 25 years, especially, we worked very hard on building communities at grassroots level, and in also the next coming 25 years, we have formidable task to establish intensive programs of growth at the grassroots level. So this spiritual access, of course, I've been aware and I've been keeping myself informed of what's been discussed on the line group. And so it has always been on my mind. But as I listened to Mr. Hassall's talk, it reminded me of Dr. Peter Kahn's seminal article back in 1980s, and he basically said it all, you know. And it's really an interesting contrast between Australia and Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. It's also, contrast is very similar between between Japan and North America, actually. Politically speaking, the tie between Japan and America is much stronger than that between Japan and Australia or New Zealand, unfortunately. But that's the material of political sense. But it's just so interesting that the Guardian mentioned this concept as early as 1950s. And so maybe when I was a student back in 70s, 80s, still the relationship between Japan and Australia was not that strong. But after that, it became more and more strong, and more Japanese people go to Australia, either sightseeing or studying, and vice versa, actually. So, but then I was thinking that in terms of Baha'i community development, there's also a contrast between Australia and Japan. Australia has developed more rapidly, and then larger community, has more diversity, and Japanese Baha'i community, unfortunately, still very small. And there's diversity there, but in terms of the numerical growth, it hasn't grown much, and that's a big challenge for us to overcome. However, if you look at the more larger, like a general society, this spiritual axis, and then around which the the communities and countries in the Pacific region revolve is being realized more and more. For example, I work at the university, so we have a JICA program, and through which students from these Pacific Island countries and Southeast Asia and South Asia come to Japanese universities and study. So, so this like a spiritual axis is there and like a functioning, as the axis around which these communities, smaller communities are like a revolving and working and growing. And so as I listened to the talk tonight, I was thinking, because we have a formidable task of establishing IPGs in all the clusters in Japan. By the way, we have 94 clusters in Japan, and more than half are inhabited by Baha'is, actually, basically unopened, So how much work we have to accomplish. And definitely, what we have set up goals already for the coming 9 years, as all other NSAs have done. And at least the first half of these 94 clusters will be the targets of the 9-year plan. And IPGs are to be established in all these remaining clusters, about 45 clusters. And after that, of course, we have 60 more years, 60 more years, during which we have to establish IPGs. So definitely we have to send domestic pioneers, or maybe international pioneers, to these, what should I say, burgeoning clusters. For this purpose, maybe we can borrow some human resources from Australia and New Zealand, maybe other countries. So I don't know if that makes much sense, because the Japan is supposed to be the northern pole of the spiritual axis, and then other communities will be revolving around, but then Japan will be revolving around other stronger communities. So anyway, the growth is mysterious, as Graham pointed out. We don't know what's going to happen, because in the past, even past few years, 2 years, or maybe 1 year actually, few exciting things happened in Japan. 2 clusters passed the 3rd milestone, and even before the 9-year plan started, so we already accomplished one of the goals for the 9-year plan before this new plan has been launched, which was actually very unexpected, because even one of the clusters, which is a Fukuoka cluster, had only 25 core activities at the beginning of 2021, Risbon. So in 1 year's time, less than 1 year, they increased the core activities by 70 or 75, which is astonishing. So anyway, that's about all I can say for now. And then I hope to hear more from other friends.